Hey, good morning, all. Welcome to the Common Good podcast. It's Friday, April 23rd, also the day that NASA shot a rocket up toward the moon with people in it, a crewed spacecraft. Not, crewed meaning there's people in it, men and women. And it's an exciting day. On Fridays, we talk about science and the common good and how it can be connected. And today, we're going to ask you to, again, turn your sights toward the skies and your imagination toward the future. And so excited to have Laura Forczyk with us, with joining Paul Wallace and myself, as we talk about the work that she does with her company, Astralytical, and as she writes on the website, doing some work with the rise of the space age millennial. So Laura, so good to have you here. Paul, good to see you. You are both in and around the Atlanta area. I am in Minneapolis. If you're watching on the live stream, let us know where you're watching from and what it is that you're doing. And if you even knew there was a rocket launch today. I didn't know. I woke up today to news that, SpaceX had partnered with NASA and shot people into space. That used to be a thing you'd get up and pay attention to, and somehow I missed it. So, but Laura, good to have you with us. You probably knew about this. Did you know about this rocket being launched into space before?
I did know. I almost set my alarm, but I decided against it. So I'm very pleased that it launched. It looked beautiful.
Yeah, it's really something. Okay, Laura, so tell us, Paul and I referenced you last week. We showed a video of a CNN story, which was talking about the work that's going on with the little station outside the moon. And I said, I think what Laura is doing with her company, Astralytical, is really interesting, really intriguing. Let's see if there's any chance she would come on the podcast. And lo and behold, here you are. So thanks for being here with us. Tell us a little bit about why you started this company and what you're doing with it, and especially this part about the rise of the space age millennials and how younger people and women are engaged in this work of space and engineering and physics and astrophysics. Because for Paul and I've mentioned a number of times in this podcast, it has felt to me like an older generation, and certainly, from my memory of the 60s and 70s, a male-dominated world. So tell us about what you're doing.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And thanks for having me on. I'll talk about space all the time to anybody. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity. And my company focuses on really promoting and helping to navigate the new commercial space industry. When you think back to how it used to be during the dawn of the space age, it was very much national, the United States against the Soviets. And it was a bit of a, it was the Cold War. It was a military prowess with some scientific progress stuck in there. And it's changed significantly over those past 50, 60 years, where now we're seeing private companies either partnering with government agencies or completely going on their own to explore the stars and to make a profit in space and to figure out how best to really advance humanity one stage at a time. And sometimes it's best to think about the space industry not as a single industry, but as a place where we can now expand humanity. And there's so many different ways that we can do it. We can look with robots that we send, like the robots. There were 3 that were sent to Mars that got there back in February, including one that was sent by NASA with a helicopter, the first powered flight on another planet. And there's also human spaceflight, like this morning, SpaceX sending NASA astronauts and international partners to the space station. And hopefully later this year, an entirely commercial mission, the very first entirely commercial mission ever to launch, called Inspiration 4, with 4 crew members who were not government astronauts at all. And so you can see there's all kinds of ways to get involved. I mean, there's the mundane stuff that we don't even think about, like GPS satellites and weather satellites and communication satellites. And then there's the real futuristic stuff of setting a base on the moon and mining on the moon and really making sure that we can learn everything from the moon so that we can go to Mars and learn how to land humans on Mars and live there. So my book that I wrote last year, I published it a little over a year ago. It was Rise of the Space Age Millennials, the Space Aspirations of a Rising Generation. It was really a way to recapture the millennial perspective and refocus it. Because when I started writing the book 4 or 5 years ago, millennials were a bit of a butt of a joke. and and it wasn't a fair representation of my generation. I'm an older millennial, and instead of trying to fight against those stereotypes, I decided to examine them. I'm a physicist by training, and so I decided to go kind of ask over 100 millennials. I interviewed over 100 people who fit that millennial category, who either were working or were studying to work in the space sector. And I really wanted to probe those stereotypes. And while doing so, I also got a look at what inspired millennials to join the space sector. For older generations, it was the Apollo program and all the fantastic things that happened in the early space industry. But for millennials, it's actually largely the newer companies like SpaceX and Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin and what's called the new space movement of the past 20 years or so that really inspired the younger generations to get involved in space. I also looked at how millennials work best and the intergenerational back and forth between millennials and older generations and how international it is. Because if you think back to the Apollo generation, it was very nationalistic. And with millennials, it's much more international by nature because space is global by its very nature. So you're seeing a lot more international partnerships, especially where commerce is concerned, because commerce knows no boundaries except the ones that governments put in. And they're also looking at what's going on in the future, where millennials want to go in the future, and looking at the different ways that people can get involved. It's not just engineers. It's not just scientists. I am a scientist, but it's not just scientists. It's all kinds of people who can be involved in space now because of all the opportunities. Communications and business and art and all these different ways that people can get involved and where we want to go in the future. And in fact, I'm about to put out a second edition of the book, hopefully in the next month or so. I interviewed members of Generation Z, university students, older members of Generation Z, those who are about to enter the workforce and what they think and probing their perspectives as well.
So we have talked here and sort of bemoaned the fact that business and commercial enterprises are what are the new backbone of the NASA space project. And I've wondered if it's a good idea or not. You seem to be a pretty firm advocate that it is a good thing and it's part of what the future is going to look like. Can you talk a little bit about why that part feels good to you? That Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and the Boeing and all the other groups that are doing this work, that they're turning this to private and to commercial enterprise. Why that's a good idea?
Sure. Well, thinking back to the dawn of the space age, companies have always been involved. There's always been, the Lockheed and the Martin Marietta and all these other companies that have been involved sort of behind the scenes where they were contractors to NASA. So commercial companies have always been involved in space. Now you're seeing a transition from government owned and government managed and government operated to a partnership model or a service model where the government is buying services from commercial companies. And this started really, for the most part, about a decade ago, and it was controversial. So NASA decided after the space shuttles retired in 2011 that commercial companies were going to build the transportation to fly astronauts and cargo to the International Space Station. And they contracted several companies for cargo and eventually 2 companies for crew, Boeing and SpaceX. And we've seen last year was the first SpaceX crewed launch to the International Space Station. It's been a phenomenal success. We saw another one this morning. And the difference in price, the difference in speed is just, there's no comparison. If you look to see how expensive it was for NASA to buy flights from the Russians on a Soyuz rocket, that was something like $80 billion per flight, something like that. It was very, very expensive. NASA flying its own people on space shuttle, I don't actually know the numbers off the top of my head, but it was quite expensive. But NASA purchasing flights from SpaceX, it's something like 30, 40, it's very 40 million. I mean, it's very it's about half the price. It's such a difference. And
Wow.
you see that SpaceX can launch more frequently. NASA's only buying about 2 flights on SpaceX per year, 2 or 3 per year. However, SpaceX is now also contracting to other companies, and that's the beauty of this model. Is it's not just now government and only government. Now SpaceX can take that capability and use it for their own benefit. They're going to be flying with a company called Axiom. Axiom has 4 people that they've booked on their first flight early next year to fly with SpaceX to the International Space Station. So companies can now make a money with this. So it's really an interesting partnership. And we're seeing it with the Artemis program too. NASA's Artemis program is to send people back to the moon sustainably. So not like it was back in the 60s and 70s where it was very political. And once we beat the Russians, we stopped because there was no real reason. No, it was extremely expensive and no real reason to continue politically. But if we're going to go back sustainably, then we need to have it be worthwhile to the people involved and not at the whims of Congress and the White House. And therefore, you need to make it an incentive to companies. And so right now we're seeing NASA just picked, to the surprise of everyone, SpaceX as the company to land astronauts, NASA astronauts, to the surface of the moon and back, which is amazing because you could imagine that SpaceX was formed by Elon Musk to send humans to Mars. And even though the moon and Mars are very different planetary bodies, they are very similar in the fact that they have lower gravity, lower or no atmosphere. So there's similarities in how you prepare to send people to the moon and how you prepare to send people to Mars. So SpaceX can take this capability that NASA is giving them money and contracting them to take people to the moon and then use it to take people to Mars in the future, which NASA wants to do as well. Now, the big question mark is the ethics of billionaires and how much do you trust billionaires like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, who runs Blue Origin, and Richard Branson, you could go on. How much do you trust them? And that's where the government comes in to really regulate a lot of this.
Huh. Interesting. Do you think there's any other countries or groups of nations who could compete with this? I mean, because yes, the political situation is different than it was back in the 60s, but certainly, I mean, there are other countries who would be interested in getting themselves to the moon as well. I'm thinking
Absolutely.
of China, but.
Yeah, so we have something called the Artemis Accords, which is a multilateral agreement system set up by the United States and the State Department and NASA to have partnerships with with the United States as allies around the world to return people to the moon and to do science on the moon. And so I think there's been 7 or 8 signatories to the Artemis Accords. I don't know off the top of my head exactly how many, but it's a way to then create a partnership, an international partnership. Because if we're going to the moon, if we're doing these really grand missions, they are going to be international. It's not like back in the 60s when it was the United States doing it. It was now it's going to be very international. In fact, we now have, I think, a Canadian astronaut is going to fly on one of those early Artemis missions, not to the surface of the moon, but around the moon. I think it's Artemis 2, although I don't know exactly off the top of my head. So you can see how international collaboration is really going to be beneficial. The Lunar Gateway, which is a small space station or outpost around the moon, that is international. So we've got international partners helping us there. Similar to the International Space Station, just on a smaller scale. And any kind of Artemis base or lunar base is going to be international. The Europeans have something they call the Moon Village concept, which is also international. And you asked about China and Russia. They have their own plans, and it's uncertain now how much Russia is going to be participating because they have financial issues to deal with. But China is definitely going full force. And China has plans to launch people to their new space station, which they're launching as soon as this month, probably in the next week or so. And it's about a quarter of the size, about a fifth of the size of the International Space Station. So it's fairly small, but they're going to be building their own space station. And they're also going to be landing humans on the moon. That's their plan, their long-term plan. And so you can see then there's not only international cooperation, but a tiny bit of a competition. I wouldn't call it a space race because I don't think that's the right framing, but there's definitely international geopolitical competition going on between the United States and China, with Russia moving away from its partnership with the United States and moving towards a partnership with China. And it's just going to be very interesting to see how that works out.
Is it a real competition, or I mean, in the sense of who's going to get there first, or is it
no? The United States got there first, right? So you can't say who's going to be first. We were already there, and so
I mean first one back is what I meant.
It's actually more along lines of like norms, international norms. And then we get to like space law. And so it's a bit complex because we have a huge international treaty called the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. And there hasn't really been any major treaties since. There's been smaller ones. But there's international norms like property rights. And so the United States is advocating for and has signed laws to allow for property rights in space, not sovereign rights, but commercial rights to mine planetary bodies, like the moon or asteroids, and to sell those resources for the benefit of the companies, and maybe making a profit, maybe making rocket fuel or landing pads. You can do all sorts of things once you mine the raw materials at a location. And so there's that kind of international norm where some people think that shouldn't be, that it should be an international commons. And then you've got other kinds of norms about, the Outer Space Treaty is a treaty that was signed by the United States and China, but someone can withdraw from the treaty. So is China going to keep with that treaty or withdraw from it? So there's all kinds of interesting things that could play out. One of the best things that the United States could do, although I don't think that we will, is to actually partner on a very limited scale with China and encourage them to sign the Artemis Accords to abide by the norms that the United States set. I don't think that's going to happen, but that would be an ideal circumstance, in my opinion. It's just going to be, it's better to cooperate in space than it is to try to, create tensions that'll lead to misunderstandings.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, Laura, I understand that we're in an age in which the federal government of the United States will make decisions for its priorities and then will outsource the delivery of those, right? So that's just where we are, and we have to now make the best of that, as opposed to it being a project of the government. I think you were the one that said in the CNN interview we listened to last week that this is not rocket science, this is political science question about how we're going to go. I think that may have been your quote. Are there people in the political sphere that are the champions of this? I just think if it ends up being that the government's role is regulation as opposed to inspiration, that's different. And people, as we talk about this today, because we nerd out on this kind of stuff here and think it's a great idea to live well on this earth by paying attention to what's above and around this earth. Do you know of people that are in the political world that are really the great champions of this? And do you worry at all that we'll lose political interest if it becomes a more regulatory relationship to space and the private industry that's working there?
That's an interesting question. Let me first say that I stole that quote from somebody else. I didn't come up with that. I think it's a very clever quote. But it is a good quote.
Well done. We only quote you as having said that, just so you know. It's official around here. That's a Laura Forczyk
the physics and the engineering is very, very challenging. I know this as a fact, as I am a scientist, but it's the political science that is the most challenging, because you've seen over the decades how things can start and then stop based on political whims and political realities. And so the beauty of space, though, is it is bipartisan, and it is more to do with finding ways that certain members of Congress can inspire or find jobs for people within their districts or states. And so there are champions all over the place, especially in areas where NASA is most active. Florida, Texas, California to some degree. There was a hearing on Wednesday for the nomination of the new NASA administrator, Bill Nelson. And you could see it was very bipartisan support. And the biggest pushback that there was because of the the contract that I just mentioned earlier, the Artemis landing contract for SpaceX, it was only to SpaceX, and they had initially planned to do 2 awards, one to SpaceX and the other one was going to be Boeing, according to the source document. And unfortunately, Boeing wasn't chosen because NASA didn't have enough money to choose them. Boeing is headquartered in Washington State, and the senator from Washington was like, why can't they compete this and get 2? And so you can really see the support is around the regions of where these politicians are, rather than political lines. And so when you're asking about regulations versus inspiration, it's an interesting question because there's always been regulation. There's so much regulation, people don't know about it because they're not working around it.
Right.
But regulations in terms of you need to have permission from the FCC for broadband use. And that's a big one right now because there's a battle between terrestrial broadband and space broadband, and all the satellite constellations right now that are going to be using that kinds of broadbands, the signals, and how do you divvy that out. And as a physicist, I always find it funny to talk about divvying out broadband, but it's a real concern, right? How do you
it is.
between terrestrial interests and space interests? And speaking of those constellations, more and more and more satellites are being launched than ever before. SpaceX has now launched over 1,000 Starlink satellites. They have plans for tens of thousands. There are other constellations out there, both within the United States and also in the UK and in China and elsewhere, that want to launch thousands of satellites. We call this a constellation, a mega constellation, really. And it's interfering with the astronomy observations, both visible and radio. And so how do you balance that? How do you balance the fact that the night sky is changing once again? Right. And you want these satellites in some way because they're beneficial. They're either bringing broadband satellite internet to rural communities or to the middle of the ocean for ships or to air travel. They're useful and they're beneficial to society, to humanity. But then you have the science side of how do you get the observations that you need while these satellites are going through your field of view. And so that's a regulatory question right now. If in order to launch, it has to be launched safely. So the FAA, which we usually think of in terms of launching aircraft, also regulates spacecraft and the launching and landing of spacecraft and making sure that the people on the ground are safe. So there's all kinds of regulation already in place. The United States is a leader in space around the world, it's commercial space, because we have the very business-friendly way of looking at space. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. That is, again, not partisan. That is very bipartisan. And so when you're thinking about inspiration, then you can think that one of the reasons why NASA, for example, is contracting out commercial companies to do things like create commercial space stations in the future, because the International Space Station is over 20 years old and it's going to have the end of its life sometime in the next decade, maybe even sooner. They're talking maybe 2025, but hopefully I'm hopeful a little bit longer. But what's going to happen after that is there's going to be commercial space stations. And so if NASA can then pay to send its people to a commercial space station and its science experiments to commercial space stations, it frees up money to do the inspirational stuff that companies can't do, like sending people to the moon and Mars. So there's always room for inspiration, especially with an agency like NASA, not so much for the practical uses of like the Department of Defense, which we haven't even covered because they're a huge player in space. They're more practical and real life things that we don't talk about so much. But the inspiration part, NASA, landing a helicopter on the moon and flying it with the piece of the Wright brothers plane attached to the helicopter, just that's inspiration right there to me. I love that kind of thing. So there's always going to be room for inspiration as well.
Is that what happened? This helicopter that's flying around has a piece of the Wright brothers plane attached to it, or
that's right,
built into it?
I love the symbolism. The first flight
awesome.
On that plane, right? First flight ever is now a piece on the first powered flight on another world. It's a beautiful symbolism.
Wow. Hey, what's happening in the science, you two? We got an astrophysicist here and a physicist here. What is there about to be a breakthrough in the science side of all of this, or is the real interest in applying the science that we already know?
This could go in so many directions. I love gravitational waves. Like, that's just one of my favorite topics. I think that's awesome stuff. So if you don't know what that is, so we've got the electromagnetic spectrum, right? That is all kinds of different wavelengths of light, visible light from, microwave to gamma ray. And then you factor in this other type of light. In a sense, it's not really light, but this other way of looking at the universe, and you can see how black holes are formed and how that affects the ripples of the universe. And I love that kind of thing. So there's always room for really hardcore like science that has nothing to do with the practical uses at all, as far as we can know right now. I love it.
Paul, what do you think? Is there something fresh happening in the science world that you're knowing about and excited about? I think we may have lost Paul's audio. I think he's lost us. He's now staring into nowhere, and I know he's got to leave at 11:30 Eastern time.
That is the beauty of pure science, is you don't know where it's going to lead. So primarily NASA does do these fantastic science experiments, whether it's a probe to another world, like New Horizons is now the 5th most distant probe that we've ever sent out in the universe. We've got the 2 Voyager probes and the 2 Pioneer probes, and now New Horizons that went past Pluto is now the farthest along, and you just don't know what it's going to find. I mean, Pluto was such a surprise to us, right? And it's such an active planetary body. And you keep using that phrase, planetary body. I'm a planetary scientist, and we don't really distinguish between what a formal definition of a planet is versus planetary bodies. There's so many planetary bodies out there.
Yeah, because there was a big debate a while back whether Pluto should be categorized as a planet or not.
I think I go by the geophysical definition of a planet, in which we have over 100 planets in our solar system. That's the way that most planetary scientists think about it. But there's also exoplanets out there, which is amazing. So there have been thousands of planets discovered outside of our solar system orbiting other stars. And it just goes to show the diversity of the universe and how we can really learn about our own planetary system and our own Earth based on what we learn out in the cosmos. And it's just awesome stuff.
One of the things that's so exciting about this current flight that's taken off is that the chief, I think the pilot of the rocket that took off this morning, is Megan MacArthur, a woman flying this spaceship. What do you call it? It's a rocket still at this point. Once the booster comes back,
so the capsule. The Dragon capsule is on top of the rocket, right? And so the rocket takes off, launches the capsule, and then the booster, the initial booster, actually lands back down on Earth to be reused. And the capsule goes and docks with the International Space Station.
Okay, I want to ask you 2 things about that. One, about how exciting it is that someone like Megan MacArthur is the pilot. She's in the pilot seat on this, and what that means for space and what it means for the gender issues that have surrounded science and space. But then also, I know the SpaceX big thing is that they want to reuse the rocket boosters. Is this going to sort of be the thing now where NASA has to say, like, hey, we want to fly with you, SpaceX, but we don't want to pick up one of these old used rocket boosters. We want to go on the new model of rocket booster. Like, this idea that there's going to be previously used versions, it's like buying an old bike or a car from 3 or 4 years ago. That seems great and cool, but also just sort of bizarre that each rocket will have a model year of when it was first fired. So talk about either of those first that you want to, either how great it is that Megan MacArthur is the pilot of this spacecraft right now, or
first surprise, because I think that the booster that SpaceX launched this morning, I think that actually was previously used. I'm pretty sure.
It's already a used trip.
But you can really think about it in terms of aircraft, right? We don't throw away the aircraft and start anew every time we take a plane flight. We reuse the aircraft, we refurbish it, we reuse it, right? There's little maintenance in between, and then we go fly again. And in fact, flying on a brand new aircraft is probably considered riskier because it hasn't gotten its hasn't gotten, bugs kicked out or whatever, right? So it's actually now that not just NASA, but the Department of Defense is also contracting out used boosters. They're allowing SpaceX to choose which booster to fly as long as SpaceX can meet the requirements, both safety and mission requirements. So I think that's actually the future of spaceflight. It's going to be what makes spaceflight cheaper, more accessible to everybody. Now, in terms of women flying in space, I love this topic because it's such a divergence from how it used to be. If you think back to, for example, the original Mercury astronauts that were chosen, they were all men because they were only allowed to be like fighter pilots, test pilots, and only men were allowed to be. And in fact, there was a group of women that were unofficially chosen called the Mercury 13 that were put to, with the same test. They were put on under medical testing, the same exact test that the men did, the Mercury 7 astronauts, the same tests, but women actually did them better. And so these women, they did them, they passed with flying colors and in some cases beat the men. But they were not allowed ultimately. And there was a big congressional hearing about it back in the day. And ultimately, these women were never allowed to be chosen as astronauts. There are a few still left alive. And the one I interviewed for my upcoming book, actually, she still has plans to fly on Virgin Galactic if Virgin Galactic ever becomes operational, because these women had this dream of spaceflight, but they just were not permitted, which is quite different from actually the cosmonauts, the Russians. The Russians made sure to fly Valentina Tereshkova as proof that their Russian Soviets were superior to Americans. So they actually took a different approach. And it was symbolic because then they didn't fly another woman for 20 years. But they still flew 2 women cosmonauts before Sally Ride flew as the first American astronaut. And there's been over 500 astronauts. I don't know the exact number off the top of my head. I think we're up to like 560, 570. I don't remember. But only like 10% have been women. And if you remember, about 2 years ago, there was going to be the first all-woman EVA spacewalk. But one of the spacesuits that was initially chosen didn't fit one of the women properly. So she wanted to go down a size to a medium. I think she had chosen a large and she wanted to go to a medium, but there wasn't enough medium sized because it takes the spacesuits that NASA had. They were like lots of large sizes, a few medium sizes, and like no small sizes. And so that got canceled. And we had to wait several more months before having the first all-female EVA. And that is something that is just unacceptable. We need to start thinking about inclusivity of not just gender, but like body types and, different types of abilities and, the different ways that people can really contribute. So when you're thinking about the future, there are a number of ways that governments are, trying to help with this, transition from how it used to be very exclusive to only a certain type of white man who had a fighter pilot experience to now more representation of the entire human body. And so the first people, I should say, who are chosen to land on the moon through NASA's Artemis program is going to be the first woman and the first person of color. Those are the 2 criteria. And if you look at the pool of astronauts that they've chosen, about half of them are women and about half of them are people of color in some way or another, which is just interesting to me that they purposely chose that, because I think that can really help to inspire people. There's a quote out there that you can't be what you can't see. So Sally Ride broke that, right? She was the first woman astronaut here in the United States, and she inspired countless people, countless women, to then fly in space or apply to become astronauts or somehow get involved in space. So you can imagine how that inspiration would carry on.
Yeah, totally.
And when we're talking about other types of people, I just want to add in that the Europeans are actually thinking in a different way. They're also thinking about disabilities. And right now they have a call out for astronauts, the first one in a while for the European Space Agency. And they're talking about getting an astronaut who has a limb disability, which I think is also another way to look at it. There's going to be that mission I told you about earlier, that first all commercial mission called Inspiration 4. It's going to house the first person with a prosthetic. She was chosen because she is a nurse, I think, at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. And she was chosen, she survived bone cancer as a child, and she has a prosthetic and she walks still with a limp. And so that's going to be the first person who flies in space with a prosthetic. And so really looking to see how we can have a more representative body of humanity up in space.
Yeah. That's great. What is it that can categorize someone as an astronaut? Do they have to have flown? Like, is that what makes someone an astronaut?
Okay, how much time do we have? That could be a whole other topic.
Really?
So,
I thought that was a simple question. Good.
Oh, the complex question. I'll go short here. Briefly, there are different categories that people have in their minds of what an astronaut is.
Mm-hmm.
I am inclusive. I say an astronaut is anyone who has been to space. And space is, to me, anybody who is above 80 miles, because that's what the United States government defines as space. There's also something called the Kármán line, which is defined as 100 kilometers. 80 kilometers is what I should have said earlier. 50 miles. I'm sorry, conversions. So 50 miles or 80 kilometers is the what the United States defines. Other agencies define it as 100 kilometers. That's called the Von Karman line. And then there's also how many orbits do you need to do? Do you need to do one full orbit, or can you go up suborbit? So the Association of Space Explorers, which is a group that is entirely made up of astronauts who have flown once around. And Yuri Gagarin, the first astronaut in space, the first cosmonaut, I should say, he flew all around. But our first astronauts only went up in suborbit and back down. So if you're talking about, going to the International Space Station, which orbits Earth, versus Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin, which just go up and down, is that space? I think it is. Other people disagree. So it's a complex question, but to me, it doesn't necessarily even matter. Oh, here's another one: is what do you do in space? Because Bill Nelson, who is the nominee to be the next NASA administrator, he is a politician, a lifelong politician. He was a member of the House of Representatives and then became a senator. And while he was a politician, he flew in space for about a week. Was he an astronaut? He was called a payload specialist. To me, that's an astronaut. He flew up there for a week. Other people don't consider him an astronaut because he was just sort of up there as a joyride, sort of. And so there's so many different ways to look at it. But for me, I think right now, everybody is an astronaut until we define it differently, like aviators versus just passengers on a flight.
I guess this tells us now that it's beyond, the Buzz Aldrins and whoever the cosmonauts were, that there's enough people doing things up in the air that these classifications have to now be made. That in and of itself is, I guess, a testimony to the fact that there's been a lot of action going on up in.
So much change, so much perspective change, the more people who fly. So as these suborbital companies come online, hopefully in the next 5 years, hopefully, they've been long delayed, more and more people, I'm talking thousands of people, might have the opportunity to fly in space. People like you and me who are just a little bit wealthier than me. I don't know about you, but people who can afford a $250,000 ticket, who can go up there for a few minutes and come back down. And once you start getting to know more people like that, or more people who can go up with SpaceX and go to the space station, or go a free flying trip around the Earth, or go to the moon, there's another mission that's contracted out by a Japanese billionaire who's going to take one of SpaceX's new rockets called the Starship and go around the moon and back. And he wants to take anybody who he considers creative. So initially it was any artist, and now it's really anybody who is creative. And so once you know more and more people who are quote unquote normal people, who are flying in space or have flown in space, it's going to change our perspective of both what an astronaut is, and also humanity's look on the sphere, our own planet, our world, because there are no boundaries in space other than the geographic boundaries. It's not countries, it's not states, it's just one planet Earth with a fragile little tiny atmosphere. People who have flown in space have talked about how fragile the Earth looks and how much it makes them really appreciate our home planet, and also the artificial boundaries that we put in place that just don't exist anymore, or don't exist in reality, I should say, and how that might change the perspective of humanity once more and more people get to fly.
I guess it would be hard for people now to imagine, and maybe you can see it easier than some people, that 100 years ago, being on a big ship that would go from one continent to another was mind-bending to people, that was possible. And then just regular transportation was happening and people started to move, across the Atlantic Ocean, or that space flight, even the 1960s, was really an elite experience that only some people did. And People went their whole lifetime only knowing someone who had ever flown on an airplane. And now we complain about, how expensive the food is at the airport, or how uncomfortable the seats are, and if we got a decent ticket or not, if we had to fly on Spirit Air. Those kinds of shifts, or the automobile as a means of transportation, or going to college, or all of these things that have seemed like they were far outside the realm of what ordinary people would do. And people would say to themselves, I can't imagine why you would need to go on a ship across an ocean, or why you would need to own a car, or why you need to be on an airplane or go to college. But now those things are just built into our regular system of sort of assumption. Not everyone does them, of course not, but they're not seen as elite as they were at one moment. Do you think in the next 50 years that you will look back and say, oh, when I was first, founding Astralytical and doing this work and coaching people on their career to get into space, it was like only $250,000 payments would get you up into space. Who would have imagined that now do you think it'll be like that? Or will this be something more like deep sea diving that's, I guess anyone can do it, but they don't really. Like, most people don't really go to the bottom of the ocean and start, exploring around and all that. Do you think it's going to be more like these popular things, or is it going to be more like a niche-y thing that's being done by some people, but it's not really part of the popular experience?
Right. Is it adventure tourism, like climbing Mount Everest, or is it hopping on a plane? And I can see both.
That was a quicker way to say it than my long drawn out explanation. Yes.
I think about this
thought
stuff,
about
right?
this apparently.
And
yeah.
Nobody really knows the future, right? We can only hope. So I have 3 young children, and I'm hoping by the time that they, have the money to be able to fly in space, that it's that accessible. I'm really hoping that as it becomes more commonplace, the prices will come down, and it'll be like you and me being able to fly on a plane. I don't know if you and me will be able to fly. Like, I'm hoping that I'll be able to go. That's my personal dream. But I'm hoping at least my children will be able to, right? I'm hoping that future will come that we don't think of it as something special, that it's just integrated into our society, as you were saying. And whether or not people, will have the opportunity, or whether it will remain space is like a something for rich people to play with, I don't know. I can only hope that we can drive the direction that we want to go in, which is to make it accessible for everybody. Because it's not only about just experiencing the fun of microgravity, for example. It's not just about having fun. There's some real honest, good, like, science experiments. I'm a scientist, right? I've done science on those parabolic flights. I don't know if you know what those are, but they're like the vomit comet. You climb and dive and climb and dive. And as you're diving, you get 25 seconds of microgravity. I've done experiments on those planes. And there's real science that can be done. There's real benefit to going into space, and there's benefit to having humans in space in addition to the automated payloads or robotics. And so you can really imagine a future where space is just another place to work. Space is another place to operate. Space is a place where you go to do what it is that you're called to do, whether that is something scientifically related or whether it's just a means to get from one part of the planet to another. I used to work for a company that unfortunately went bankrupt, but they had plans to do something called point-to-point transportation, super fast transportation from one side of the globe to the other. I'm talking, halfway across the world.
Going up into space and falling back down on the other side? That's what they were going to do?
Space and then come back down across the planet for only like 2 hours instead of, having it be 15 hours or whatever the flights are now. So that kind of like really practical use, that might be decades out. It might even be hundreds of years out. We don't really know the future, but that's the kind of future that I imagine, is that space is not something special. Space is just, you and I are in space. We're just on a planet, on the surface of a planet in space, right? And that's how we need to orient our minds to think that space is not necessarily special. It's just, we used to be stuck on the ground, and now we fly or dive underwater, deeper than humans can go by themselves.
Yeah.
Space is just another place to operate, whether we are having fun or whether we're doing something, making a living. It's just another place to go.
I can imagine people who listen to this and they think to themselves, but I kind of like having something that feels otherworldly, like that's really out there. And to borrow a phrase, space is that final frontier, right? Of what, like let's not let's not go out there, set up a Starbucks, start mining some asteroid, just turn the beauty of the stars into, Montana, which is mostly empty, but, we're just kind of digging around out there. Is there part of that you feel like is in the popular culture that we need to, that's going to have to be, people are going to have to be brought along if this is seen as exciting and not as like, yeah, we got rich dudes, trying to patch their egos by beating the other billionaire to be the one that can launch people into space to just take over that area as well? Do you think that's like,
it's about protecting Earth. So it's not about, destroying space. There's nothing in space as far as we know. I think that astrobiology, or the search for life outside of Earth, I think that's one of the most amazing things that we could be doing. But as far as we know, we have not detected life outside of planet Earth yet. There's absolutely no life on the moon, I can tell you that. There's probably no life on Mars, but we still need to figure that out. There's no life on asteroids. Those things are just rocks hurling in space. There's nothing there. So if we can protect Earth, if we can protect Montana, if we can protect the beautiful ecosystem that we have on Earth, and instead mine an asteroid that's just dead, it's just rocks in space, why wouldn't we? Why wouldn't we use those raw materials to benefit humanity while protecting our own planet, right? And so if we can rephrase that to make it so that we go out into space, yes, to explore, to final frontier and all of that, I think that's a beautiful way to look at it. We're going to Mars. There's amazing moons out there, Enceladus and Europa and Titan, and there's so many cool moons out there around Saturn and Jupiter and elsewhere. Going to explore those places because we are explorers, but also making sure that we do this in a way that, benefits humanity in space and benefits humanity here on planet Earth, because this is our planet. There's no other planet out there that we know of that is anywhere as beautiful and wonderful as planet Earth. So it's all about protecting our home planet and making it better.
How'd you get into this and be so excited about this? What was it? You started with falling in love with the moon or the sky or the notion, and then pursued physics as a way to get there, or you were pursuing physics and you fell in love along the way? Like how did it happen?
I guess I skipped my whole intro in the beginning. So yeah, I remember in 3rd grade, we read a story about Apollo astronauts landing on the moon. And I just thought that was fascinating. And I pictured myself as an astronaut landing on the moon. And then my parents bought me one of those really simple telescopes. So I remember in middle school, I had one of those telescopes. I just had it in the front yard. We lived in the suburbs, so there's not a whole lot you could see, right? But, I still pointed that thing out in the stars and the moon, and I just wanted to explore it. And then my parents sent me to space camp in Huntsville, Alabama, which was amazing for me. That was where I really fell in love with it. I was in middle school, 7th grade or so, and I fell in love with space. I just absolutely knew that's where I belonged. So then when I decided to choose a major for college, I chose astrophysics because I loved the idea of using the basic sciences to understand, and since this is a religious podcast, to understand creation, to understand how it is that God created the universe and all the beauty that we have surrounding us both here on planet Earth and in the cosmos. And I just absolutely got inspired by that whole thing. And I remember then transitioning from, okay, the cosmos are beautiful. How do we make it so that we use the practical knowledge we're finding in space to benefit life on Earth? And so that's been a transition for me, is the pure sciences to the practical sciences. And how do we really make it so that, you and I and everybody else on the planet benefits from the stuff that we do in space?
What was going on with your parents that they're buying you telescopes and sending you to space camp and all of that?
My parents have no idea where I got this. They're both lawyers. They have no clue where I got the inspiration, but they did raise me with Star Trek. So I watched Star Trek with them. I watched, Next Generation, Voyager, Deep Space Nine, so even the Alien series, Ripley is amazing to me. So they raised me on science fiction. And I think it's just science fiction that inspired me to pursue what could become science reality.
One of the things you do that you mentioned on the website is you do coaching, space career coaching for people. So I think that's really great. And I'm glad people will know about it, because you write that sometimes we need someone to listen to our dreams and assure us that we're on the right path. Sometimes we need a course correction. Sometimes we don't just know where to be. We don't know where to begin. Whether you have a technical background or a non-traditional background, let me help. So that idea that you want to not only help industries figure out and politics figure out how to connect with what industries can be doing, but you're trying to help people if they want to think about a career in space. Are you the only group and company out there saying, hey, y'all, let me help you think about a career in space? Or is this now an industry?
I believe that Astralytical was the very first company to formally make it a space career coaching. Since then, there have been 2 small things that have popped up. I don't know how active they are. But yeah, it's been phenomenal how much I can give back to these people, the people who come to me with their dreams, whether they are a college student or whether they are a recent graduate or whether they, had a career in something like, oil and gas or like business administration or politics, and they want to switch over to space and they just don't know how, because they have this image in mind that space is not only untouchable but for scientists and engineers only, and both of those are not true. When you get into the space sector and you look at bios and you get to see the diverse places that people have come from, the diverse backgrounds, the diverse disciplines, space is multidisciplinary by nature. We need every sort of person involved in space. So the majority of my clients actually come from outside the space sector. Some of them are university students studying science or engineering, but most of them, have some kind of other background or an engineering background that they've applied elsewhere, to some other industry. And I'm helping them realize that dream that they had to work in space is not impossible. In fact, the skills that they already have, whether it is, the most out there one was a dental hygienist who came to me who wanted to get into astronomy, and she was already involved in a 2nd degree program working to get a degree in astronomy. So I'm like, yes, you can use your background in dental hygiene for a space career, and it's just ways that you can use what you've already done, because you don't want to get, space is very insular and you don't want to get that bubble effect, that echo effect, that chamber effect, right? You want the outsiders to come in and say, this is how we've done it, or this is what I've seen. Have you ever tried it this way? And that's where you get the most growth. So I think it's really important to notice that space is very multidisciplinary. Space is not just one industry. We haven't even touched on like agriculture and like disaster relief and all the different ways that space is used because of all the satellites up there. It's so multidisciplinary. There's a space for everyone within space.
Well, Laura Forczyk, you are a great champion for space. Thanks for all this good work. Thanks for all the time you gave us today. It's so hopeful and inspiring to know that it's, because you're right, it does feel like a very particular elite kind of thing. Like, who in the world gets to work in that field, and just feels very foreign. And you have a very invitational tone about the website and about all of this. And so I hope people will make their way over to astralytical.com and continue to follow you in all the spaces to pick up your great book, The Rise of the Space Age Millennials. I mean, that seems like a great book to give to younger people, and to make sure that this notion that engagement in the human endeavor on our Earth and in our space is something they can be part of. So thank you for being part of this today.
Thanks for inviting me on.
You are sure welcome. Hey, all, it's Friday, so we talk science. On Mondays, we talk about the news. On Tuesdays, we talk politics. Wednesday, we talk faith. Thursdays, we talk about issues that matter in our society. And that brings us back around to Fridays. On the weekends, we don't talk. People around here can't talk for 48 hours over the weekend because it's too much talking all week long. No, I'm just joking. But we'd love to have you tell us where you're at, where you're doing what you're doing. Send us an email over at podcast@vocommongood.com. If you're a podcast listener, just let us know. We love to get those messages. Tell us what's going on. If you're not on our email list, head over to vocommongood.com and get signed up for all the things that we have going on, trying to make the common good our voting criteria and our living criteria. So whether it's faith, science, news, issues that matter to you, politics, we want you to pursue the common good. Thanks for being a part of things today, and happy weekend.